Now we move to Senator Cormann.
Thank you, Madam Acting Deputy President. Madam Acting Deputy President, this is a lazy tax grab by a lazy government that was desperate for cash to fund its high-spending budget. And the people of Western Australia are being asked to pay the price, to pay the bill. We were being told, like after the election, we were being told for 6 to 7 months, we've got to fight inflation. The inflation genie is out of the bottle. We've got to cut spending. This is going to be a tough budget. What did we find out on budget night? Spending went up by $15 billion. By $15 billion. And of course, the economic conservatives that the Rudd government now are, they were desperate to ensure that they could still sort of show a bit of a surplus. So what did they have to do? We have to find some easy tax targets. Never mind the negative and disastrous flow-on consequences. Never mind that this is going to have a disastrous impact on the economy in Western Australia, on families, pensioners and businesses in Western Australia. Never mind that this is going to have disastrous consequences in terms of our sovereign risk profile. Never mind that this is not the right decision in terms of ensuring that we invest in providing for energy security, in terms of ensuring that we attract investment in an industry that can help us address the challenges of global warming by exporting LNG in some of those Asia-Pacific markets. Never mind that this is a time when we should be doing everything we can to attract investment, both from an economic and from an environmental point of view, because it will help us ensure our energy security into the future, because it will help us address the challenges of climate change, and because it will help us continue to grow and to continue to ensure our economic prosperity into the future. This is an ad hoc measure. Like Senator Johnson said in his speech earlier today, it is a drive-by shooting. This is not a serious attempt to properly balance the quite appropriate necessity for an appropriate return to the community from this sort of industry. This is not a serious attempt to balance the attempt to provide an appropriate return to the community with the need to provide a competitive taxation framework for an important industry. This is an ad hoc measure. This is a government that very quickly had to look for $2.5 billion, and they thought, oh, well, this is big oil and gas companies. Who is going to stand up for them? This is going to be easy politically for us to sell. The same way that they tried to sell a $3.2 billion tax take on so-called alcopops as a health measure, even though they never talked to the health department about it. These are all tax measures. They're driven out of Treasury, and there's nothing else to it. If they were serious about taking a strategic view on this, they would have actually asked the Henry Review into the taxation system to consider this issue first and then come up with whatever taxation framework the government considered appropriate. But no, they put in a $2.5 billion additional tax grab, targeted the North West Shelf project outside of any strategic consideration, and being quite happy to take all of the negative public policy flow-on consequences that might come its way. Now, let's just talk about the sovereign risk profile and our attractiveness as an investment destination. The reality is this. We are in an environment where there is huge pressure, huge demand pressure for LNG, which we have in abundance, but which we are not exploiting to our full potential. We need to attract investment, but we are actually a high-cost investment destination compared to other investment destinations in the Asia-Pacific. We have got technological, geological challenges that we face, and compared to other potential investment destinations, we are at a comparative disadvantage. Our sovereign risk profile, our political stability, our highly skilled workforce, these were the competitive advantages that we were able to bring into play to attract that necessary investment and to increase production, to increase gas production in Australia, which is quite frankly what we should be aiming for. The government doesn't worry about this, doesn't worry about our sovereign risk profile, doesn't worry that gas projects of this nature are very capital intensive. The North West Shelf gas project has invested $25 billion worth of funding into that particular project. Now, $25 billion. Do you think if you put $25 billion on the table that you don't want some certainty in terms of your cost structures, in terms of the fiscal arrangement that you operate within? Do you think you're going to put $25 billion on the table if the government, at a whim, without even going through a proper process, can just throw all of that overboard? I mean, for 30 years, we had bipartisan commitment to giving a proper, stable fiscal framework to this very, very important project. It was the first such major project that we were able to get off the ground here in Australia. Sir Charles Court, the Premier of Western Australia, Malcolm Fraser, the then Prime Minister, and the project proponents sat down and came up with an arrangement that ensured that this project would get off the ground, and it did, and it was very successful. And we should do more of this. We should do more of this. And, you know, to their credit, the Hawke government, the Keating government, and the Howard government after that essentially went along with what was a very clear understanding of the fiscal arrangement that was in place to ensure that this project would get off the ground and continue to expand and continue to provide the significant export income, the significant taxation revenue, and the significant benefits to our economy that it has. Now, how did the government go about this? I mean, when you make a major change like this and you want to ensure that any impact on our sovereign risk profile is minimised, don't you think you would sit down with the stakeholders concerned and consult and sort of say, look, this is what we're thinking. We don't think that you're paying enough. We think that we ought to revisit that exemption which was agreed to 30 years ago. Don't you think you'd sort of say, OK, well, let's sit down. How can we ensure that both parties or all parties to the agreement, all parties to the arrangement can come up with the best possible way forward to ensure that it is a win-win? The government did not consult with anyone. Not even that. I mean, Treasury did not even consult with the most expert Commonwealth department on this measure. The Department of Resources, Energy and Tourism, which I think it's called these days, was not consulted. And I mean, quite frankly, the government would have done very well to look at some of the evidence in Senate estimates. And I refer very specifically to the evidence on the 31st of May 2005 by Mr. Hartwell, head of the Resources Division in the Department of Resources, Energy and Tourism. Because if Treasury had had a close look at this, they would have actually been able to provide advice to the Treasurer that his argument that somehow this is closing a loophole, that this is getting rid of a taxation advantage, is actually nothing more than a furphy. It is absolute dishonest spin. The government went out there and tried to justify this measure by sort of stating that somehow the North West Shelf gas project inappropriately benefited from a taxation advantage that was not available to anybody else. That is not true. It is absolutely incorrect. Firstly, when I asked Treasury whether they had done any modelling to substantiate that assertion put out there by the Treasurer, i.e., in order to benefit from a taxation advantage, it has to be an advantage compared to somebody else, presumably compared to somebody else faced with the same set of circumstances. Well, firstly, is there any offshore gas project other than the North West Shelf that is currently paying excise on condensate? You'll find that there is not, because straight after this North West Shelf project got off the ground, the then government in 1987, I believe, introduced what was called the Petroleum Resource Rent Tax. Now, the Petroleum Resource Rent Tax is a profit-based tax. It is a system of secondary taxation that essentially allows major gas projects of this nature to make major deduction in terms of exploration expense and various other allowable deductions, which can be compounded forward, etc., etc. Projects these days that would essentially start off something like the North West Shelf did 30 years ago will not pay any secondary taxation for at least 5 to 10 years. Don't take my word for it. That is the evidence at Senate estimates, because they will be able to deduct a whole heap of expenditure which was never the circumstance for the North West Shelf project. Treasury, during the inquiry we had, actually was trying to make the point, well, they were exempt from all secondary taxation. When I sort of tested this and sent an email back afterwards and said, well, hang on, this is not quite right. Surely, I mean, as I understand it, they've paid royalties and they've paid excise on everything other than condensate on production from day one. And in fact, yes, the response was, yes, they have. Now, the latest information that came my way, I'm now being told that Woodside actually wrote to the Treasurer earlier this week and provided advice that under its calculations, the Northwest Shelf venture actually paid $8 billion more in tax than it would have if it had been subject to the PRRT arrangements. $8 billion more in tax than it would have if it had been subject to the PRRT arrangements. Where is the taxation advantage in that? Can somebody tell me where the taxation advantage is in this? I mean, essentially, the Treasurer went out there trying to justify a $2.5 billion tax grab, which of course the businesses that are affected by that will try to pass on to their customers, which of course then will put upward pressure on the price of gas and the price of electricity, which of course is going to put pressure on families, pensioners and businesses in Western Australia, and all to fund Kevin Rudd's, the Rudd government's big spending, big taxing budget. Now, Treasury, I asked Treasury, did you actually model to substantiate the assertion made by the Treasurer that this is a taxation advantage? No, we did not. I mean, they got lost in all sorts of arguments, and I might just quote you some of the exchanges, which were quite amusing if it wasn't so serious. I sort of asked Treasury, now, I read a quote to them from Mr. Don Volti, that this is not a loophole or a free ride which has come to an end. This is a negotiated fiscal arrangement which formed the basis of Australia's largest resource development. Now, Treasury officials told the committee, contrary to suggestions from industry, we have not been able to find any statements or documents which suggest that the exemption was supposed to apply indefinitely. So they haven't been able to find any evidence that it was, but they can't rule it out either. But then, in evidence before the committee, the project has had an exemption from all secondary taxation at the Commonwealth level, not counting the royalty arrangement which is in place with the states. It has been exempt from crude oil excise for 30 years. Wrong. Wrong. And that was evidence provided by Treasury at our inquiry. Now, if Treasury doesn't understand what is being proposed, how can this Senate have any confidence to pass this bill? How can we have any confidence that this is actually a properly substantiated measure, properly thought through, properly assessing all of the flow-on consequences, in particular on the people and the businesses in Western Australia? Now here, then again, the project that we are talking about has enjoyed for 30 years an exemption from the secondary taxation regime to which it was subject. Wrong. Now I'll just read for the benefit of the Senate specifically what the North West Shelf project has paid. Petroleum royalties set at a rate of between 10 and 12.5% of the net wellhead value of production from each licence area. Crude oil production excise associated with crude oil produced from each petroleum field, crude oil production on the North West Shelf, has not been excise exempt. Now, you know what else there is? If you go back to the 31st of May 2005 evidence by Mr. Hartwell, he actually told Senator O'Brien, when he asked him questions about this, if the North West Shelf project had been subject to PRRT instead of the excise and royalty regime to which it is subject, that it was his opinion that the secondary taxation liability would have been about the same. Now, when you've got a senior expert Commonwealth official who makes that sort of assertion on the 31st of May 2005, and you're an incoming government that is considering introducing such a measure and wanting to sell it on the basis that this is getting rid of a taxation advantage, wouldn't you think that that government would ask a question? Is that the case, or is it not the case? Don't you think that the Treasurer, wanting to go out and say we're closing a loophole, we are getting rid of a taxation advantage, would have asked his department? Look, there was this answer on 31 May 2005 by Mr. Hartwell where he said this. Now, I want to say that. Can you give me some evidence? Now, in all of the inquiry, during Senate estimates, during the Senate inquiry, I have not had one answer where Treasury was actually able to substantiate the Treasurer's assertion that the North West Shelf gas project benefited from a taxation advantage. And even worse, today we find out that Woodside, which now has done the analysis, has actually written to the Treasurer, and advised the Treasurer that in their calculation they have paid $8 billion more in secondary taxation than they would have under the PRRT arrangements. Now, I expect an answer from the government about this, because why should the people of Western Australia pay for higher gas prices, higher electricity prices, have a serious negative impact on their economy, just so that the Rudd government can put another $2.5 billion into its high-spending budget. Now, let's just reflect on what happened on September the 6th, because I was quite stunned. When this measure was first announced on budget night, the next day I read in the West Australian a quote from Alan Carpenter, then Premier for Western Australia. And essentially, Alan Carpenter straight away was an apologist for the Rudd government. Straight away he said, yeah, no worries. Because clearly, the Rudd government, if they thought about one thing, the Rudd government, the one thing they thought about is how to buy off the state of Western Australia. We're going to make this change. It's going to have a flow-on impact on your budget, so we're going to have a couple of $100 million there to make sure that you're not going to be worse off as a state government, as a Labor state government. So, Alan Carpenter, what does he say? Oh, yeah, sure, no worries. This should not have any impact on investment on the North West Shelf. We're quite happy for the Rudd government to go ahead. Now, I was just flabbergasted. We've got a great tradition in Western Australia of premiers standing up for our state, of premiers actually standing up to the government in Canberra, no matter which political persuasions. I can tell you now, ask Malcolm Fraser whether Sir Charles would have just waved him through. Ask John Howard whether Richard Court would have just waved him through. I think the answer is no. And I think you'll find that on September 6th, that this is one of the reasons why the decision of the people of Western Australia went the way it did. And then Woodside came out and told people the bleeding obvious. If we are going to be faced with this $2.5 billion tax, we will seek to pass it on. What did the Premier do in Western Australia, the then Premier Alan Carpenter? He shot the messenger. He said, Woodside, this is outrageous. Woodside shouldn't be allowed to do this. We should send them to this body and that body. Instead of standing up to Canberra, instead of telling Kevin Rudd to actually do things to support important Western Australian industry, to stand up for the economic prosperity in Australia and in Western Australia, and to stand up for our capacity to contribute to energy security and to addressing the global challenge of climate change. Now, Madam Acting Deputy President, this is a bad public policy measure. It is a lazy tax grab. It's a lazy tax grab by a lazy government that essentially was desperate to find some cash to fund its high-spending budget. This measure should not be supported. This measure is very bad public policy. This should have gone through a proper strategic process. The Henry Review of Taxation should have looked at this strategically to ensure we appropriately balance the need to provide appropriate returns to the community with the need to provide a competitive taxation arrangement. This measure should not have been introduced as an ad hoc measure in the budget on the 13th of May. And in my opinion, the Senate should very strongly vote against this.
Thank you, Senator Cormann.